I truly think that far fewer young Americans should go to college and university, especially at least straight away. I knew a lot of students who could have been doing more productive things and as a result could have been happier human beings if they hadn't bought in or their parents hadn't bought in or the culture hadn't kind of corralled them into this idea that college education is the only path forward.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Eric Daniels. Eric is the assistant director of Clemson University's Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And Eric has a very interesting career story in that he's worked in almost every level of education. He has been a middle school science teacher. He was head of school at a Montessori school in Southern California, where he worked with infants all the way through 8th grade students. And he's worked inside of various institutions at the collegiate level, including his current role at Clemson. In today's episode, Eric and I talk about how working with all of these different developmental stages and levels of education has shaped his philosophy as an educator. We talk about the students that he has coming into his programs at Clemson and the biggest things he's observed from reading applications and noticing the trends over time in the things that students are learning about and also the gaps in what they're learning. We talk about how to think about the development of thought and critical thinking and reasoning in students and how the early years are very important in building the foundation of how students will think and learn later in life. We talk about some of the biggest lessons that Eric draws from Montessori and the biggest lessons he's drawn from being a head of school and how that translates to the work that he does now inside of the university. And we talk about some of the biggest things that parents should be thinking about as they aspire to raise young people who are strong thinkers, independent adults stepping out into the world, and who have a strong sense of direction and purpose, not just over the course of their intellectual inquiry, but also over the course of their lives. This was an absolutely delightful conversation. Eric and I could have very easily talked for 6 hours, not just 2, but I hope that you find this conversation valuable, and I hope you enjoy listening. Eric Daniels, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
I'm so excited that we're finally doing this. When I first started Rebel Educator and was sharing on social media what I was up to, I remember you sending me a message and telling me you were recommending books that I should read. And they were books by Susan Engel.
Yep.
And I bought a copy of The Intellectual Lives of Children and I read it, and it was extremely enlightening, extremely formative in my thinking about the intellectual development of young children. So I am infinitely grateful to you for that. And we probably should have booked a podcast interview right then. But I'm glad we're finally doing this.
Yeah, no, I like her work a lot. Some of the other stuff that we recommended. I mean, I remember you posted once a stack of books of things that you had been reading, and it was like, probably 4/5 of those I had done myself, I had encountered, but then there were these other ones that I hadn't encountered, and then, was subsequently introduced to via your recommendation. So the feeling is mutual for sure.
But you can't really tell because of the camera focus. But behind me, that bookshelf right behind me is all books on education now. I've been working on my collection whenever someone recommends something or it comes across my radar. The library has gotten much bigger since I posted that picture. But Susan Engel has been one of my favorites, and I recommend it frequently to people. Where did you first encounter her work? Did it coincide with your work inside of schools?
It did. Yes. I think I first came across the one of the other books, not The Intellectual Lives of Children, but the book. I'm trying to. I should remember the title of the book about curiosity. So I had I'd gone down a deep dive on the nature of childhood curiosity in particular, and curiosity more general as a human intellectual trait. And I think I might have bumped into her work via Jess Leahy, who I'm sure you're also familiar with, who's great. And I just started reading some of the cognitive psychology literature on curiosity, some of the popular books on curiosity. And I was at the time, that was when I was the head of school at a Montessori school, and trying to really get my head around what the nature of children's fascination with knowledge and the world and growing and developing intellectually, and what the narrative and a lot of that work and that research suggests is sometimes how the schooling system breaks down and turns that off. And one of the most interesting things to me about her work and other work in this area is the idea that curiosity is and can be a truly human trait across a lifetime. And a lot of people just assume, the perpetual questioning, asking why, trying to find things out is a uniquely childhood phenomenon. And I always wanna tell people it is only if you ruin it. Like, only if you allow the system to grind it out of people. Like, it's something that, I mean, at least I find that that's how I operate, and I know other people that do. And so that's how I came across it, and it like for you, it really just resonated with so much that I knew and understood from my own experience. So, it was a kind of a roundabout way. There was no particular task, no particular reason I came across it. I was just doing this deep dive on something that I was curious about, as it were.
Your story is very interesting inside of the realm of education because you've worn many hats
Yeah.
over the course of your career. You mentioned being head of school at a Montessori school. You're now the assistant director of Clemson's Institute for the Study of Capitalism. You've been in many different
Yeah.
arenas inside the education world over the course of your career, and I don't actually know the backstory. And I'm very
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah, so let's start at the beginning. So right now, as you said, I'm the assistant director for Clemson's Institute for the Study of Capitalism, which is the easy way to summarize what we do, and we can get into this a little bit more when we talk about some of the programs. The easy way to summarize what we do is that we are coming up on our 20th anniversary. I started at the Clemson Institute a year after it was founded. It was founded by Brad Thompson. At the time, it was just him. It was founded with a grant from the BB&T Foundation. And John Allison, who was at the BB&T Bank, then he was the CEO and chairman of the bank, had started making grants to universities in the Southeast, basically in BB&T's footprint, to form or create these institutes or programs or even just classes focused on the moral foundations of capitalism. And we very quickly became the flagship of that network. And what we do is, unlike a lot of other places in universities that are focused on the economics of capitalism, what we're focused on primarily is the moral, intellectual, political, and legal foundations of capitalism. So we're interested more in the questions of what is it that supports a free society in more than just the way the economy works? What are the other institutions and other ideas that ultimately form that foundation? And then we have now, for the last almost 10 years, our signature Lyceum program, which is a scholarship program. But I'm sure we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But to give you the background, all of the different hats that I've worn. So I still teach here at the Clemson Institute. I do administrative work as well as the assistant director, but I teach regularly. I teach in the classroom every semester, and have been teaching really my whole career in one form or another. But that career has involved both university level teaching here at Clemson, and then before that at Duke University, but as well as a middle school science teacher for a couple of years, and then as a head of school as you said, at LaPorte Montessori I think I did that for about 4 years. And during that time, I always saw, even those years that I was in the head of school role, I had been trained. I'm trained at the Montessori adolescent level, and we had an adolescent classroom or community. And so I always made sure that I got back to that classroom to engage the students in a teaching capacity as well. So I wasn't formally one of the guides that was in the classroom, but I always saw that as part of my role in leadership to make sure that I was in the classroom. So yeah, I've done it from a number of different levels, and uniquely, I know a lot of people start at one level of education and move to another one. I've actually moved and moved back. I think I'm really lucky to be able to have done that, to move from university education into younger education, which really I was driven to at the time. I knew a lot of people involved in the school that I moved to, and it was a really interesting project. And I'd actually consulted on some of their curriculum development earlier, years before I got there. And the Montessori idea really ignited something for me about younger education. And, my own education was just standard government schooling through, K through 12. I had great teachers. I had awful teachers, good classes, bad classes, like most people. But I remember when I first visited the school when I was doing the consulting, and I had the opportunity to observe in some of the younger age classrooms, and then also just to interact with some of the students that were there in after school care. And it was different. It was the approach, the attitude of the children, the way that the adults interacted with the children, all of that kind of captivated me. And so when I had the opportunity, it was the right time in my life. I sort of took a leap. I left Clemson and moved out there to be a middle school teacher, and I was going to teach history, which is what my PhD is in. And as it turned out, there was, as often happens in independent schools, there was a staffing need, and um, I've always been fascinated by science, and I love science. I never really did advanced training in science, but I got the opportunity to teach 7th and 8th grade science, and just ran with it. A friend of mine who has a PhD in physics said that's about the level that I should be teaching, because that's about, like I can keep ahead of the students. Like it's the non-mathematical, it's still conceptual at that level. So I did that for a couple of years, and then again, an opportunity arose in the school leadership realm, where the Montessori project was so exciting to me, and it was going to be a really big emphasis in the company. And so I said, I'd never conceptualized that I would be in leadership and administration, but I decided, I believe in this project enough, and I think that I can have an impact from this position, that's wider than just what I can do in the classroom on more children's lives. So I really I embraced it and did it. And then ultimately, things changed with the school, and I decided, and it was right before the pandemic, actually. I decided that maybe I wanted to consider a next move, and the opportunity arose to come back to Clemson, which I was very excited about. I left here on good terms. Brad and I are great friends, and he was incredibly supportive of the decision for me to do this. He had taught at a high school before himself, so he's also been at different levels of education. So he understood part of the fascination with it, and he let me know, like if you ever want to come back, if the time is right, and the time was right, and here I am.
I'm very curious about the underlying fascinations that led you across different levels of education. And I'm also very curious about the body of knowledge that you've collected about education holistically by having all of these different experiences. When you work with kids at all of these different age levels and in different places of their journey, you get a very holistic perspective of how one thing begets another, how one thing affects another, what foundational pieces are important to make sure you're getting right, to see them positively expressed at later levels. And I'm very curious about how this, both what drove this from the beginning, if this was part of what you were seeking in
Yeah.
working at different levels, and also how it has affected your overall philosophy of education to have had such an unusually broad array of experiences.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's interesting. You've hit on the head, the exact issue. So one of the things that was on my mind, I had been teaching I had taught during graduate school. So I basically, at the end of my undergraduate education, starting the first year of graduate school, I was TA and I was teaching. So I've always been in the classroom. And one of the, one of the interesting things when I first started graduate school, this is pretty funny for anybody that knows, my sort of body of work. I had the misimpression that I would do the teaching thing because it was part of the job, but I really wanted to just write, 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 write. And as soon as I got into a classroom, I had tutored and I had done other, kinds of teaching in college and earlier, but I got into a classroom and I was captivated. The best advice I ever had when I was a college student, I had no idea what I was going to do. I mean, I truly, I wasn't sure whether I was going to go to graduate school or law school or whatever. I had a professor that I was friends with that gave me the piece of advice that he said, don't think about the profession. Don't think about the career. Don't think about the job title of what you want to do. Focus instead on spending some time reflecting on the kinds of things that you like to do, the tasks, the types of intellectual challenges. Are you a person who likes to take a lot of discrete information and put it together? Are you a synthesizer? Or are you a person who likes to learn new things? Do you like to do the same thing over and over? All that kind of, day-to-day activity. And he said, then once you get a really good sense of who you are about those kinds of things, and for me, it was I loved learning new things. I loved exposing myself to new ideas. I loved explaining things, telling stories, etc. And to me, that all added up to, okay, well, what kinds of professions does this feature the most prominently? And a professor was a natural sort of outlet for that. So that's what I pursued. And I did it for, I guess it was about more than a decade, so maybe 10, 12 years. And my assessment of, and as I said, I had been at Duke, so I had some of, the very academically considered best students in the country. Clemson is a very good school, but it's a state school, so it gets a wider array of educational backgrounds. I taught in the summers at Georgetown University through the Fund for American Studies, which brings students in from universities all over the country. So really a wide array of students. And one of the things that I began to observe about students at university level in particular was that in a certain way, I felt like I was a provider of information rather than someone who was shaping them. So what I mean by this is that I used to joke that college students kind of arrive on campus already half baked, in the sense that a lot of the fundamental things about their thinking methods, about their approach to knowledge, about their moral character, or about their human development more broadly, has already been set in a way that although you can affect that trajectory, and you can certainly facilitate them discovering new things and kind of finding out new ways of going about their lives, you're not as fundamentally involved in shaping it. And so that was part of what was so attractive to me to teach younger students, was that they were at an earlier stage, that they still were discovering so much about being conscious of their own thinking methods, of understanding how to approach different fields. That they were, in a sense, they were still more open to a wider range of approaches because they hadn't yet been shaped in that way. And so when I got to the middle school teaching, that immediate, that was obvious that I was right about that. That these students. The other thing is I saw them every day. I went to recess with them. I ate lunch with them. As a middle school teacher in a small, private Montessori school, you get to know the students really well. They get to know you really well, and you feel like there's a much more of a mentorship aspect to your relationship. And I saw students develop, in a way that I hadn't, because you see them a couple times a week for 15 weeks in a semester at university. That's a little bit different now with the Lyceum program, which I'll, again, keep promising I'll get to. But um, and so that was really rewarding, seeing, especially at adolescence. I know a lot of people, when I left university teaching and said, "Oh, I'm going to go teach middle school," they were like, "Oh my gosh, adolescents, are you
Good
crazy?"
luck.
Yeah, no, but adolescents. I was in a Orange County, California private school, so very self-selected in a certain way. But we had scholarships. We had kids that weren't just elite rich kids or whatever. Um, but as well, I think what I learned so much in my Montessori training at the adolescent level is that adolescence it's an incredibly interesting time in human development. It's the main, what Montessori identified, and what I think cognitive psychology has laid out, and sort of demonstrated in more sophisticated ways, perhaps, or at least more publishable research ways than she did, is that adolescence is a time where there's a significant amount of self-formation that's going on, right? That early childhood, what Montessori called the sensitive periods of the absorbent mind, when children are first learning how to master sensory information and to process that and to start to become conceptual. And then the transition to childhood, with sort of 6 to 12 period, children are, I mean, anyone who has children this age, no, they're just absorbers of information in a way that's different from the sensory and physical absorption of the early ages. They are just the why questions. They're curious. They want to know the world beyond themselves. Like I always say that a child in a 3 to 6 year old classroom is wants to know how to read a clock, right? They see a clock in the classroom and they're like, "What is that? I want to know what that is." A child at the 6 to 12 age wants to know why we know that it's 11:30 in one time zone, but 3:30 in another. Like, who figured that out? They start to globalize their interest, and then adolescence is a turning back inward, right? I mean, we all know this. Puberty hits, you become awkward, your body starts growing, all of these developmental changes are happening. But it's also a time when human beings naturally start to ask the question, what kind of person am I? In the childhood phase, they're still thinking about what's out there in the great big world. But as an adolescent, they start to ask themselves, who am I? What kind of a person am I? They start to become more self introspective. And they also start to get to that age, which frustrates a lot of parents and maybe a lot of teachers as well, where they realize that a large part of the world that they've learned about is actually based upon choices that previous human beings and civilizations have made. And that in some way makes that contingent. And it in some way makes them feel incredibly empowered that they can have an impact on the world, that they can change the world, that they can make those decisions in the future. And so they start testing and exploring and doing all those things. So it was really fascinating to me to contemplate, as a guide in those classrooms to teach those students to facilitate their ability to, in a sense, dream big about what they wanted to do with their lives. And I had seen that in bits and pieces in some of my students at the university level, but not completely, right? And so that was incredibly rewarding. As a head of school, I confess, the favorite classroom for me to visit was a toddler classroom, a 2 and 3 year old, 18 to 3 year old classroom. Now, in many ways, Montessori describes that this is a parallel phase of development to adolescence, and so maybe that's one of the reasons. But for me, what toddlers do when they're mastering their own environment and the look of joy on their face, for example, when they first can use a spoon the right way, or even the constructive phases of their repetition. What Montessori describes, that if a parent or a guide, someone interacting with this child, is willing to observe and not intervene, right, and which is a huge part of Montessori, is letting the child develop themselves and facilitating that rather than constructing a child. They construct themselves. But watching them, for example, toddlers are endlessly repeating tasks that seem as though they've mastered them, right? They can do it. And as an adult, you want them to move on to the next skill. You want them to scale up, right? Because of probably the educational drive to just, constantly move to the next thing. But they keep repeating the same action. And what's interesting is that Montessori points out, because they're not yet fully verbal in their native tongue, they can't tell us what they're doing, and they may not even be able to give an account of it. They may not be reflective enough at that age to give an account of it. But what it is that they're doing is that there's something about their own development that's telling them there's a purpose to this, right? It may be that they're experimenting, that they're learning more about the world, they're understanding causality at a deep level by repeating things. And it was just fascinating for me to observe in those classrooms. I mean, watching the children in primary, learn language and when they first learn how to write themselves, and the kind of fascination on their face when they realize, like, oh my gosh, I can transcribe my thoughts, and then they get to doing that, and it's like, wow, you have some interesting thoughts. But I think what Montessori gave me by doing that, and by, as you said, sort of jumping around the divides, the somewhat arbitrary divides of education age-wise, is that by the time I got back to college education and re-entered a classroom, I was all the more aware of, I suppose, what different students were actually arriving at, right? That before I thought, okay, they take a class, they get some information, they do a paper, they do a test, and they move on. I was more attuned and aware of, I guess, what Montessori calls developmental tendencies, right? These areas where students have different parts of, by the time they reach, 17, 18 years old and they're in college, different parts of their personality that they're still forming out. And then importantly, in the area of sort of 18 to 24, that last phase of formation, their moral development. And so that actually lets me pivot to one of the really cool things about what we do. So I mentioned a couple times now the Lyceum program here at Clemson. So what was initially just a program that Brad Thompson had come up with as a way of, when he and I were here in the early years, we taught classes, we hosted lectures, we attended conferences, hosted conferences, and we were just trying to figure out what it was that we could do that was really unique. And we had students who were really desperate to take multiple classes with us, but we could only teach so much. And Brad eventually came up with this idea, like, what if we had an academic program that was in parallel to what students do for their academic major that focused on the ideas that we cared about the most? So what the Lyceum program does is it is effectively, what we describe it as is it's a great books approach to exploring the foundations of a free society. So the political, sort of the foundations of American political system, capitalism, and most importantly, I think the formation and roots of moral character in a person. And so what we do is the students take 8 classes. We recruit students as scholars. They get a scholarship. We have 10 scholars every year. Some years we've had 20 when we get additional grants, but we have 10 scholars every year, and they come in and they matriculate as a cohort. They take these 8 classes together across their 4 years here. They do Socratic tutorials, which is where they meet with us one-on-one every other week to talk about moral character, to talk about the important ideas that they learn in the classroom and how to translate them into the real world, into their lives. And in effect, what it is for me is it's like almost like a St. John's experience, like St. John's College, within a larger university where students can still do, for example, we have mechanical engineering majors or economics majors or whatever. I mean, in a way, it's trying to balance out one of the things that has gone awry in the modern university, which is that it's hyper-specialized, career-focused, and unfortunately, like a lot of earlier education, is cut off from the idea of students being engaged in thinking about big questions. And so when I came back, I was excited to come back to the Lyceum program because it does focus a lot. I mean, I spend, hours every week talking to students one-on-one about morality, and I teach in the classroom big important ideas about. I mean, I teach constitutional law. I teach a course on the political theory of capitalism. I teach American political thought. But we read. I mean, the big thing is we read the original text, right? When we go down political theory of capitalism, we read The Wealth of Nations. Not just excerpts, not a secondary source about Adam Smith, but we read Adam Smith and dig into it and talk about it and say, what are the right and wrong ideas here? What has he got to say? What is his unique insight? And then we do the same across all these other authors. They read Plato, they read Aristotle, they read all the way across the sort of Western canon, as it's called, and do so while they can also, take the kinds of classes that parents are willing to pay the money that's now required to go to university, or to borrow the money, I suppose, in some cases, but to make it a balanced education, really like a liberal arts core within whatever else you want to do with your college education. And the results have just been amazing. I mean, not only do we recruit really good students because we have that selective process of the scholarship, but the kind of interest and ambition of these young men and women has really amazed me. Like what they've gone on to do, they've done, incredible things. So that's really rewarding as well. That's something I didn't see before. Was now I get to know these students as soon as they enter the program, and I interview them. I'm part of the interview team. I get to know them, but then I see them develop, and I interact with them throughout their 4 years, and then see where they go. And that's something I'd never had before in the university education. So I'm really fortunate that the Lyceum program allows that.
I imagine that your reading list is quite extensive for the Lyceum program.
Yeah.
Are there, this may be a very difficult question to answer. It may not even be a good question. But if you had to pinpoint, in your opinion, the most important books that students read over the course of this experience? I imagine for each one it's a little different in terms of what's most formative, what's shaping their thought. But if you were to recommend a person listening to this to read perhaps a handful of the books that are in your curriculum that you think are the most important for developing an understanding and appreciation of these ideas of capitalism, liberty, free society, morality, which ones do you think are the most important?
Yeah, that is a really tough question. Because the tough thing is to say, why not do them all? But then I realized that, for our students, that's anywhere from, 6 to 8 books a semester across 8 semesters. And for anyone listening, that may be, a big project to read through. I think for me, if I had to pick, let me say I would pick. What I'm going to do, I'm going to, there's some obvious ones that everybody is probably aware of. Plato's Republic is one of the books that they read. Hobbes' Leviathan. Some of the kind of classics in political theory. But one of the things that I like the most is that we read sometimes what are great books that are not as sort of commonly known as part of the great books curriculum. So, Wealth of Nations is one that I teach that I'm a big fan of. So many people think that they know what Adam Smith is about, and kind of get the basic ideas, and it is for his key insights that have carried over into the economics profession. It's very easy, but as most people may not realize, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. His first work, which he edited 6 times over his lifetime, was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And that has a profound impact on how he talks about the wealth of nations in that treatise. And his Wealth of Nations really, it's, on the nature and causes of the wealth of nations is the full title. The project is an attempt to describe what he calls the simple system of natural liberty. And it's an attempt to lay out the ways that human societies develop naturally and the kinds of impediments that governments have put in the way of natural liberty and the ways that we can get back to that in a sense, right, in his own time, and then, lessons for ourselves. But it has a lot to do with the ways that human beings relate to each other in a free society and what that means, not just about, for example, the invisible hand and the division of labor, which are the classic concepts in Smith. So I'm a big fan of it. It's a long work, it's usually 2 volumes or it's a big, thick book, but it's very rich. I will tell your listeners that they can profitably skip the section on silver prices and banking. Those are 2 sections which are worth reading for certain things, but they are quite long digressions in the work. Another one I think that I would say, maybe if I have to narrow it down maybe to 3. So the Wealth of Nations, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is one of the works that the freshmen read in their Wisdom of the Ancients course. And I think that is, many students relate after they read that. That is one of the books where they first start thinking seriously about what virtue is and what it means to live a virtuous life. Not just to talk about virtue, not to just know the names of certain virtues, but to actually struggle through the problem of understanding what it means to uphold a certain virtue in action. And there's a great material there on friendship that Aristotle has, which is something that, young men and women at their age, they've just left high school, where for many of them, not all of them, we get a lot of homeschool kids, which is great. But they often have left a situation where they have default friends, and they're now in college where they have to think consciously about their friendships. And the Nicomachean Ethics is a wonderful way for them to think seriously about that for the first time. So that would be another one. And then I suppose, maybe I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of other great works. And for your listeners, if they're curious, there's probably on our website, which is easy to find. It's just clemson.edu/capitalism is our home site, and then you can navigate down through that. Mm-hmm. There's a picture. There's a stack of books picture that we used for marketing purposes once, which has effectively a pretty good representation of our reading list. that they can find there. And there may even be mentions of a lot of the works that the students read. Or, I'm happy to field emails if people want to know different courses, different readings. One of the great things about the two, I mentioned the Nicomachean Ethics is one that they do in a course called The Wisdom of the Ancients, which is the first course that the students take when they're here. And that's focused on ancient philosophers' perspectives on the question of moral character. And then the last course that they take as a senior, their capstone course, is The Wisdom of the Moderns. And that's a course where they take, which is not necessarily through moral or political theory, but it's often through novels. And so the students in that course often get to read about different perspectives on moral character through modern novels, sort of Shakespeare to the present, or plays sometimes as well. Shakespeare plays are featured. But the great thing about that course is that there's a wider, sort of array of books, and they sort of change over time. So it doesn't always end up being the same set of books for every group of students. And then we also, we just had our welcome event for our new freshmen yesterday. We also maintain, I think it's a 9-page single-spaced list of the great books that they can consider, and we do reading groups with the students. Yeah. So now, admittedly, I don't think it's just straight through, but it's sort of chronological first, and then by theme. So, like, what is justice? Love and marriage. Different questions like that. Science, ancient and modern. And so there's recategorization. So it may be somewhat repeating, but it's basically just a big list that we give them. And then we invite them to do essentially extracurricular reading groups with us. So for in the past, groups of students have done Tocqueville's Democracy in America as a reading group. They've done Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, some Jane Austen novels, other things. So they have a chance to really engage with that aspect of their education and continue what I think is the core of what a good education is, which is exploring the curiosity and the big ideas. In addition, say, to getting all of the accounting training that they might need to succeed in their chosen profession, which lots of them have professions where they may not naturally be humanists or become teachers or professors, although we have some of those as well, which is great. But it's something that I think what we describe is that it's a program that seeks to produce good human beings. And that more than anything, if I would say that, I'm asked from time to time, what do I think a successful Lyceum graduate is? And it's very easy to brag on our graduates. We have a former student at Harvard Law School, one that just graduated from Chicago, two in the past couple of years that have won Fulbrights, and one who was Clemson's first Rhodes Scholar, which is like the world's most prestigious scholarship. And those are really easy accolades. We've got 5 or 6 that are in graduate school now, one who's one of the very early scholars who did graduate school and is now a professor himself. But I think that the real measure of the success of the program is that I like to think that the graduates are the type of people that I want to be, friends with, or that I would want to relate with, or that I would want to work with. That they're flourishing, successful human beings first, and then, the success of profession or outcome is they kind of take care of that on their own. But what we're really focused on is making sure that they're, essentially, good, happy people. And that's our job. And it's really fun.
It sounds really fun.
Yeah. There are such a variety of young men and women with such different interests that I really like the fact that the conversations are unpredictable, but always really interesting.
Well, it sounds like an exceptional group of people that are being selected to be part of this program. And I find it interesting you talking about being a part of the interview team. So you're a part of the selection process.
Yeah.
So you're working with a highly curated group of students who have earned the right to be a part of this program, but you're also teaching classes beyond this small selected group.
Yeah.
And you're also interviewing lots of applicants coming who
and reading
be.
lots and lots of applications. We got 1,000 applications, 1,002 applications last year for the 10 spots, which is our highest number ever. I mean, we blew through the roof of the number of applications.
That's crazy.
Yeah. when it comes time to read them all, it is a little crazy. Yeah. So the process. So these students apply to Clemson on their own, right? The requirement is we have no independent authority to admit them to Clemson. So they have to be able to get themselves into Clemson, which anymore is not as easy as it used to be. Although I don't think it's ever been particularly easy. It's just that like a lot of institutions of its profile, it's grown the number of applicants to its programs just generally. So they have to get in themselves, and then our application is basically, I mean, the aside from just filling out your demographic information and so on, it's essentially 3 essays that ask students. One essay effectively focuses on a meaningful book that they've read and having them tell us about how that's affected the way they think or live. There's a question that changes from year to year, but it's essentially the middle question I like to think of as our "How do you think about morality?" question. And then our last question is "How do you think about government in a free society?" Question. And they're short essay questions, but they form the basis of how we evaluate those applications and then invite students for a half-hour interview, which 2 professors, get on a Zoom call with these young men and women. And you say half an hour and they think, "Oh my gosh, that's so long," and then it's over before they know it. And we really just have them expand on the ideas, and we have a set of questions that we ask. And the real question that we have is in those interviews, when the faculty interview those young men and women, it's about, are they it's I almost hesitate to use the word because it's a little bit shop worn, but are they interesting in the sense that they have unique and perhaps maybe even unusual ways of confronting issues? And is this the kind of young man or woman that I think would be interesting to have in a seminar, right? Because that's what we're going to spend a lot of time with them. And by the time we get to that phase of the process, they're all very talented. They all have done very well in school. They have all of the outside markers of academic success, and that's fine. But what we're really concerned about is not just, is this someone who knows how to make a schedule and keep organized and do what is all too common in education today, which is be successful at playing the game, right? Because the game certainly in higher education to a certain extent, but as well at lower levels of education, as I've observed it, one of the things that I had as an experience at LaPorte when I was the head of school, as well as a middle school teacher, we stopped at 8th grade. So our students had 8th grade as the cap out, and then they ultimately had to matriculate to a high school. And there are a number of private high schools in the area, as well as prestigious public schools in the area, for what that's worth, and even some parents who chose to homeschool their children, or we had students who went to the American school in Switzerland. So all over the world, literally. But one of the things was evaluating and helping these students in 8th grade get on into high school and learning about those high schools. And one of the things that I can tell you is that, unfortunately, the trend of organized education, right? The schools per se, not education as such, where people become educated, right? Which Sheldon Richman, who I don't always agree with, but who once had a very what I think was a very telling expression, which is that we need to decouple the idea that education only takes place in a building called a school, right? Which I think is a really profound insight. But what happens in a lot of the schools in the formal education system is that students are entrained to be able to follow algorithms and inputs and outputs, and education has, unfortunately, to a large degree, become transactional, right? This is, you get a syllabus, this is what you have to do, and this is what you get out of it. And it's not transformative, right? Education at its best can be transformative. It can light an intellectual fire. It can change the way that someone thinks about something. It can amplify a passion that was unrealized as yet. It can really affect who a person is. And I think, unfortunately, for all sorts of different reasons, regulatory reasons, cultural reasons, economic reasons, education is now, in my opinion, more focused or too focused on credentialism, right? The kind of getting through the gamut and emerging on the other side employable, which I know, your biography is a great counterexample to that. I tell people about it all the time, because I know I really, it's like, in court, sometimes, there's a thing called an argument against interest. When somebody makes a point that actually isn't the best point to make because it doesn't serve their interest. Well, I mean, my interest is being a college professor, and if colleges went away, I wouldn't have a job. I mean, I would do something else. I would educate in a different way because that's my calling in a way. But I truly think that far fewer young Americans should go to college and university, especially at least straight away. I mean, if they have to do it eventually, if it's something that they want to do, or if it's something that they feel compelled to do, at the very least, if they didn't do it straight out of whatever their high school or high school equivalent education was, it would be all the better. We have a few students in our program who took gap years, um, and it's good for them, right? I mean, and for a lot of students, I mean, I've said this my whole educational career, from the time I started teaching out of graduate school at Duke, even when I was at Wisconsin as a graduate student. I knew a lot of students who could have been doing and could have been doing more productive things, and as a result could have been happier human beings, and more successful in all the ways, not just monetarily, because maybe they wouldn't necessarily be more monetarily successful than if they pursued a particular college degree, but would have been better people for it if they hadn't bought in, or their parents hadn't bought in, or the culture hadn't kind of corralled them into this idea that college education is the only path forward. Um, I think we do a really good job, and I think what we're doing in the Lyceum program is we're providing an alternative for students, often who have career paths that do require certain technical skill. I mean, you can apprentice as an engineer, but it's an easier path if you take an engineering degree and start in at a level that's more interesting for you, based on what your background is. But there's a lot of things that people can do that don't involve getting a BA or a BS. Anyway, so I think that's a big problem, and I try, as much as it is in a way against my interest, I try to be a bit of an antidote to that. I think what we're doing is great, but we can only take 10 or 20 students a year. And, even though there are most encouraging, there are other schools that have approached us and asked about trying to create their own program similar to what we do. So I hope we're the start of a change in the way that college education works, or at least an inspiration for different ways of thinking about it. But um, in the broader scale, outside of my own, desire to get more Lyceum scholars of really good quality, I do really think, like, if I had a way to get on a soapbox and tell people, um, there's a lot more in the world. And I mean, I don't know, the reporting on this to me is, I don't know how much to credit that the young generation increasingly is actually contemplating this, the mounting college debt that they hear about in the news, and this idea that Gen Z is going to be, that they're going to go back to the trades. I mean, more power to them if they do, right? Like, that'd be great. The idea that the only thing you can do is something that you get a college degree doing is I remind my students, I ask them sometimes, what do you think the percentage of Americans today of college age are enrolled in higher education and ultimately complete a 4-year degree, and then compare it to the cohorts of Americans up the age ladder? And they, because it's a availability bias, right? Everyone they know and a lot of their high school friends all went to college. And certainly that's who they relate to. They're at college. Everybody they know is in college. But the reality is that it's not the majority of Americans. And I ask them sometimes, like, what do you think they're doing? Do you think they're happy? Do you think that they have a fulfilled life? Because I guarantee you that they do, most of them, that they made a path. And I mean, some of them are making an Instagram channel about this alternative, path, or they have a whole, podcast about it. I mean, like, really, I think it's really impressive to me that there's more and more discussion of this, because it used to be like education's dirty little secret that you didn't need to do this. And I want people to know this. If college is right for you, come do a great thing. And if you want to, and you're of college age and you want to apply to Clemson, like I encourage you. But if that's not for you, um, I know there's a lot to fight sometimes, parents and family members who just can't see it that way, et cetera. But it's not only possible, it's a great thing that's possible.
I'm really curious with the amount of exposure that you have to students who are aspiring to be part of your program. 1,000 applications is a lot to move through. What do you notice
Mm.
about the trends in the academic capacity, the intellectual training, the capacity to think broadly and creatively? I imagine a lot of that comes through in the essays that you're reading and the conversations you're having. I'm really curious what you notice about the general state of students coming into university, especially because you have such a broad philosophical foundation for understanding what
Yeah.
education is and what it ought to be and what types of thinkers and students different types of approaches produce. I'm curious what you notice or what your
Yeah.
synthesis of it is.
Yeah, I mean, so a few interesting trends that are usually easy for all of us that read the applications. There's now 9 of us, I think. Hopefully I'm counting right.
That's still a lot of applications per person to
Yeah, no, it
review.
is. Yeah,
That's
we
a
read we
hefty
read we
workload.
read a whole lot, and then I and the two assistant directors of the Lyceum program read all of the ones that get put onto the next round and then evaluate, and like there's multiple phases. So some of them we get to know pretty well. But yeah, one of the top level traits or trends rather that I've noticed is we ask on the application, what are 3 books, list 3 books that you've read that have influenced the way you think or live. And then the essay question that corresponds to that is to, without just summarizing the book, explain one of the reasons or one of the books and how it influenced the way you think or live. And the really interesting thing, year to year, one can always figure out what the latest, like, popular new book that is assigned in high schools because it shows up a lot. And so, the books that become English teachers' favorites every year, kind of know. Um, but the interesting thing in the last couple of years, which I've noticed eh, to a remarkable degree, is that the number of what I would call basic or very original by like generation, not original like unique, original self-help books that young people are reading um, has gone way up. And I don't, I'm not quite sure what to make of this in a way. I think part of it is the what I think is sometimes the unfortunate trend that a lot of young people have about the optimized life, right? That they get too early on this idea that they have to manage and optimize all aspects of their life. Nutrition, exercise. Not that those are unimportant. I mean, they're vitally important. I think everybody should pursue those things. But the sense of mastery that they attempt to instill upon what is an adolescent chaotic life, uh, I think drives them, and the sense of unease that they feel, and restlessness that they feel, I think has driven them to these books that I don't know. I mean, I've read a lot of them. Some of them are good. Some of them are just fluff. Um, but the number of young men who are impressed by the idea that making their bed every day changes their life. And it's like, I mean, I get it, but at the same time, have you not contemplated the way that thinking about the nature of truth might impact your life, or like bigger ideas, right? That yes, routines are important and schedules are important and habituation is important, but oh my gosh, are you not intaking that at an earlier phase of your life, right? What this tells me, and certainly from my perspective as a head of school at the Montessori school, is that a lot of the young men and women that enter college today have not had the opportunities of developing and scaling their own independence. And by independence, I don't mean, financial or even intellectual independence, which is, one hopes that they have. But in some cases, actual just daily living independence. And one of what I think is the most telling trends, which is probably now going on about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, but when I first heard the term adulting, of young people saying like, "Oh, hashtag adulting. I'm winning because I paid my bills today, or I did this or whatever. I had somebody come by and fix my roof." And my response to that, and I think that I first became aware of that trend. It probably was happening before I became aware of it, but I first became aware of that trend when I was at LaPorte, and my sense of it was, you're not adulting, you're living a human life. Like these are the tasks of daily living, right? And I can see, 5-year-old children who have better care of self and environment than some teenagers, let alone some college students, right? And this is an effect, a failure of both education and by proxy, I also think parenting, right? One of the sneaky and devious ways that I think the modern education system has underserved or even malserved, if I can make up a word perhaps, uh, young people and the students of that have gone through it, is that it also has short-circuited the need for parents to be more aware of what parenting is like. I mean, there's undoubtedly whole shelves of books available on parenting, and there's some good ones, right? I mean, I think Jess Leahy's book is great. Yeah, I'm sure you've got a lot of, Jess Leahy's book is great. Julia Lithcott-Haim's book on how to raise an adult is really good. There's a lot of literature. I mean, Montessori's books themselves for younger ages and other books, but I think a lot of parents, and I witnessed this when I would interview students, or I mean interview parents for new students matriculating at LaPorte, is that a lot of parents, they operate on default. They become their own parents in spite of their own protestations that they won't, and they just do what is the default option, and they do that because they've been lured into the idea that they can trust that those things will be taken care of by the formal education system. But we know that the formal education system is not, in most instances, scaling up that independence. Helping students learn how to take care of their own possessions and to cook for themselves and to make a schedule for themselves and to think about themselves in 5 years. What am I going to be doing? What does my life look like? How do I keep account of my finances, et cetera? I mean, I used to joke when I would interview parents, I would say, they would always ask, where do students go after LaPorte? Like, what high schools do they get into? As if we were the cause of these students getting in these prestigious private high schools. And I would always say they'll get into the same high schools that they would get into if you didn't bring your children to LaPorte because of your zip code and your income. I mean, to be frank, that's the reason why these children are able to get into these schools. I said, but what you will get is that you'll get a young adult who graduates from college, perhaps, that's not going to need to move back into your basement and live on your couch. They're going to be independent and flourishing, human beings that have a life of their own, that you can have a loving relationship with rather than fight them. And it's the same thing. A lot of students, I look at these essays and it strikes me that not only do I wish that they read more, too many of the books are the books that I know that they read in school. We even contemplated once putting that on the question, list 3 books that you haven't read in school that might influence the way you think or live. And it's like, okay, no, I know some kids read George Orwell on their own. Undoubtedly, that's been a popular thing lately, but it's also hard to discern whether that's something that they read in school. I just wish that they read more widely, and it's obvious, when we get homeschoolers or students in charter schools or other, classical schools, et cetera, their reading lists are always, I mean, in a way, more impressive because it's both more varied books and better books. But yeah, over the course of the interviews, I mean, last year, for example, I noticed there is a bit of the impact of that transactional approach to education. It's hard for students to take risks. It's hard for them to be controversial. When, one of our essay questions last year, a bunch of college professors thought we had designed this question really well, where there was a forced choice and they had to take one side or the other. And, little known to us, 17 and 18-year-olds have a enormous ability to figure out how to say both, both and instead of either or. And in a way that was, interesting. We learned a lesson, but it also revealed something. It revealed that there was that students were not being encouraged and given help to learn how to think for themselves and to be able to defend a position, and to be able to wither a little bit of criticism without falling apart. Um, and to have a robust discussion and debate, right? I mean, things that a lot of people today talk about as the importance of civic education. And there's a lot of programs now that focus on trying to do civic education. But as much as that's a great thing, I mean, and part of what we do, but as much as that's a great thing to do in college, if you arrive from, high school to college and you're not able to do some of those things, it's going to be a tough path, because you need to know how to resolve conflicts with your friends before you can resolve conflicts politically, to even think about such things. And I don't know that there's enough of that kind of experience because, I mean, this is astounding to me, but I have a friend whose daughter just graduated college. And I was talking to him about her experience in a very prestigious high school in the New York area. And he let me know, this was amazing to me because we were talking about Lyceum applications. He let me know that her senior year of high school, in her English class, they did not read a single book. All they did was focus on practice writing college essays. Because the incentive structure was aligned such that, whatever it was, the district said, the more kids you get into college, the better we'll evaluate you. And so the teacher said, well, your evaluation is now contingent upon the school's evaluation, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just this structure that goes all the way down that has that, brass ring, I suppose, at the end that everybody's trying to grasp at, that is, as I said, it's a bit illusory for a lot of people that that's the end in mind, but everyone seems aligned to it. And that I think is part of the problem. I think that the best essays that we get, and this is true in my classes as well at Clemson, the best writing that we see and the best essays that we get are the students who are willing to take a stand and argue for it and can support an idea and support an argument, and that do so in ways not necessarily always unconventional, because sometimes we get answers that are very middle of the road, so to speak, in terms of like where they stand on an issue, but are thoughtful in a way that is more than just, here are the 7 reasons why this A, B, C, D, E, and it's more, it's an immeasurable thing, but it's kind of more creative. It comes at it from a more organic way where that the student has actually digested and thought about the question rather than just says, okay, what are the 5 points that I need to cover? Because the difference between an essay like that, what the 5 points you need to cover versus an essay that someone has actually said, this is only 400 words. What can I cover? What can I not? What can I focus on? What can I not? Let me make my stand and take my position and really go for it. And we get lots of good students, more than we can accept, but the 1,000 doesn't all represent students that I think would be good in the program. A lot of it represents students who are very good at school. I don't know how they are as thinkers, as people, I don't know how well adapted they are. Montessori has this concept in early childhood that she calls, she describes early childhood as a kind of river. And sometimes there are obstacles. There are what she calls deviations, as you imagine a rock in a river. And, what she says is the constructive phase of human development pushes on regardless, right? Just as a river will find its way around a rock, but it creates a deviation. It creates a path of the water that was not let's say, call it the natural course of this stream. And one cannot imagine, and indeed, I'm sure some fluid dynamics class would tell me I probably can't even calculate the ways that this impacts the flow of the river. I mean, it would be an incredibly complex problem. My engineering students, I'm sure, would love to try to solve it. But in human development, those kinds of obstacles, those kinds of things that get put in the way, no matter how much we see them as necessary, have impressions and impacts downstream that sometimes we don't notice. And so, a lot of people describe the anxiety and depression levels of young people. I often wonder if that's not a result of the alignment of certain values in education, right? In the way that schools operate. yeah, maybe it's all about the social media, but it's possible it's also about the way that they're confined for 12 years in boxes, sitting up straight, not moving, being silent, asking to go to the bathroom, like all of the sort of horrors of a lot of schooling. um to think that those don't have impacts is foolish.
Can we dig deeper into that for a second? Because I
Yeah.
find that
Yeah.
very interesting. And I'm curious to hear you expand on if there are specific things that are, I mean, you just threw out a few examples, the sitting under fluorescent lighting all day, being stuck inside, having to wait for the bell. But what it is that you think that does to the soul of a child that would lead them to feel depressed, anxious, struggling to focus on the work in front of them, let alone think about what they want to accomplish out of the coming decades of their lives. I think some of it is intuitive, but
Yeah.
it's not as common of a take as blaming it on something like kids watch too much TV or they scroll too much or social media is eroding their self-esteem because they're always comparing themselves to someone else. You don't usually hear people making out the system itself to be the bad guy. It almost feels a little bit like John Taylor Gatto's
Yeah.
idea of the underlying lessons that you're getting from the structure of schooling. Like, you're not just learning about reading and math, you're learning how to sit still, how to attach your self-esteem to the approval of an authority figure. But this is
Yeah.
another, like, that's, he's not equating that to mental health. He's equating that more to sort of life trajectory
Yeah.
or autonomy and life trajectory.
Right, right. And it's a way that people shape their character.
Mhm.
And one of the things that you just said that I think really it just resonated all of a sudden. And again, you say, okay, well, Jonathan Haidt and others have made this argument that there was this change right about the time you had the front-facing iPhones, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this whole argument about social media and young girls in particular comparing themselves to unrealistic standards. And there's undoubtedly something to that. I think that there's been a lot of criticism of the research that is relied upon, Gene Twenge and others. And I'm guardedly sort of not going to take a stand on that, only because I've heard enough on both sides that I know that I know too little to make an informed judgment. But I am skeptical in a certain way because some of the cross-national comparisons and so on. But one of the things you said, where you said, one of the things that people describe as creating the anxiety or the depression or some sort of not kind of full-blown mental health issue, but a personality character issue. Well, where do you think students learn to compare themselves to everyone else? Like why is it that everyone gets to adolescence and is suddenly so sucked in by the idea of how do I look compared to so and so, or how do I perform compared to so and so? Where do I rank? What is my comparative evaluation next to them? As opposed to, what the healthy thing would be is, am I a better version of my own self 5 years ago? Am I better than I was? If you're focused on improvement, right? The healthy self-esteem preserving approach to that would be to compare one's own skills and talents and outcomes to one's own past self, because that's the only relevant variable. But schooling from a very young time in most conventional schools, we assign grades, we rank, we give objective scores to children who, despite the best of intentions of teachers of keeping these things confidential, share them with each other. Right? The idea that, I mean, I remember when I was in college, it was the time when professors would still just publicly post grades, and then they were sort of like, "Oh no, this is maybe not the best thing. Maybe you should anonymize them." And so then they just started using people's social security numbers. Like, oh my gosh, And then eventually it was like, "Oh, you have to use this randomly generated student ID number or something." But the whole thing was like, no matter what you do, and FERPA, and all the regulations that say you're not allowed to disclose these things, it's as if the students aren't talking to each other, because they're enculturated in a system that's premised upon that kind of ranking. It's no wonder that later in life, they've developed an inbuilt character trait that says, I'm other directed. I'm other directed in my own evaluation of self. I don't have a stable form of knowing whether I'm good enough and I'm capable of achieving things. I have to judge that by other people. And there are other ways that this happens in the culture. I don't know a lot about youth sports, but I'm sure some are better at doing that and some are worse and so on and so forth. But like, it is something to reflect upon, that the manifestations of the problem today may be as much to do with recent changes that have helped trigger or highlight these problems, and that the sense of conformity and measuring up and comparison has been part of how we've done education for over a century in a way that has undoubtedly been detrimental to the character of many people. I mean, it's not a mistake, I think, to note that a whole generation, whole swaths of human history, right? But I mean, even if we just take American history as a model, that whole generations of Americans learned on their parents' knees and in one-room schoolhouses with mixed ages, right? Not with age segregated classrooms magically attributed to September 1st as your birthday, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Jesse McCarthy makes a good point of this. Like, if you went to work and you only worked with people that were born within the same year you were born, you would think it was absurd. You would think it was absolutely absurd. Why are we doing this? Like, different people have different talents and interests and so on. And age has nothing to do with it. And the same thing is true in childhood. Even though there's more, alignment in childhood, obviously, most 6-year-olds are basically the same, but they're not so similar that some of them aren't more like 4-year-olds and 7-year-olds, et cetera, right? That there's a reason for this. But we for the convenience of the system have put them into these boxes. And, as Montessori, not only Montessori, but others describe, the model of education that says, here's fixed times of the day, you move from one subject to the other. Even if you're deeply fascinated with history and you can sustain that interest for 3 hours in a morning, you move on after 50. Or even if you're not interested in history at that time, but you could do math for 3 hours, you're not allowed to do that, right? This is the whole sort of insanity of hyper-structured education. Now, it's not, and as the unfortunate reputation of Montessori sometimes is, it's not just free choice all the time, right? There are guides. There are people who structure the child's education and ensure that what needs to get done gets done. But there's a sense in which the autonomy of a child and the self-efficacy, right? Albert Bandura's great concept, the great cognitive psychologist, self-efficacy, the ability to see oneself able to make effective change in the world and in oneself, is an incredibly powerful thing to being a successful adult. It's what makes people able to take risks, tolerate failure, achieve real things in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the things I used to describe, that there are these what people call metacognitive skills, or sometimes they call non-cognitive, which is really weird because it's still the brain, but soft skills, sometimes people call them. Being able to brook disagreement, being able to tolerate ambiguity, communication skills, all these things. There are abilities of people to learn these later in life. And often college students get through college, they get a degree, and they go into the workforce, and they have to start learning these. And companies, offer HR training programs for these. But there's also what I think is a sensitive period for these, right? That in children's earlier education, if it's scaffolded right and if it's done right, they will acquire these skills through the natural course of childhood and adolescence, in the same way that we all know that immersion language programs from 3 to 6 can make it almost effortless for a child to learn 2 languages. At the same time that their brain is so sensitive to learning their own native language, they can also learn a second language. I've seen it happen. There was a young boy at LaPorte who grew up in an English environment, but his parents spoke Vietnamese at home, and he was in a Spanish immersion classroom. And he could speak all pretty fluently by the time he was 6, to the point that when he had graduated out of the immersion program and his parents wanted him to do an after-school program, I went to pick him up from his classroom one day, and I told him, we're going to go to your Spanish program now. And he wanted to play with Legos. And I was like, in this case, like, I have to overrule him. And I said, no, we got to go. And then we walked into the classroom with the other children and the teacher, who was the native Spanish speaker. And I, in my very rudimentary Spanish, said, this is so-and-so, and this is going to be this. This young boy started complaining, but he immediately flipped into Spanish. And he started complaining like in fluent Spanish. He was saying, I don't want to do this, no me gusta, and he was going on, because for him, the context just shifted to Spanish. So we know that that's possible. And we know, as I painfully know as an adult, learning a foreign language now is effortful. It is challenging, right? There are all kinds of ways that people are trying to develop tricks to make it easier, but it's never going to be as easy as in early childhood. I think the same thing is true of the kinds of metacognitive skills, and soft skills and sort of life skills. If that's not done in adolescence and sometimes earlier, it's not impossible. Organization, being comfortable with oneself, knowing that one's self-esteem derives from internal factors, not comparative factors, all of those kinds of things can emerge as if it were effortlessly and naturally if education is done right. They can be learned later, right? But it's like learning a foreign language. It's effortful, it's difficult, and sometimes people just can't do it. And so they struggle through life. They need aids, right? They need aid. This is the thing that to the extent that people need aids for living as adults, not always, right? I mean, it's great to cognitively offload a lot of things. I mean, it's why, I don't keep a calendar anymore. My phone does it for me. I don't, there are great ways that we can free up cognitive resources by using technology. But there are some people who use technology as a crutch, right? That they wouldn't be able to get through their day without it, or that they have other aids to living. DoorDash is an aid to not knowing how to cook. DoorDash is great when you're in a rush or you don't want to, do something. But if you can't even make yourself a meal, maybe you're not really independent in a self-actualized way. And I think that's the big difference, is that we have to focus in education on the whole human being and think about the ways that those skills scaffold up through all the ages, right? I mean, one of the things that I focus on now that I particularly notice is that it's interesting. Montessori describes childhood, so 6 to 12, right after early childhood, before adolescence, as a period of moral fervor. And I definitely see this, right? When children before the age of 6, approximately, before their baby teeth start falling out, before their growth levels off, before they stop being susceptible to childhood diseases, there's like a physical change when you notice a child enter what's the transition from early childhood to childhood. They also become, as I said, very curious. Why are the questions? But they also become very fervently aware of moral issues, right? They're constantly talking about fairness and who has propriety, right? That's mine, that's yours. They often come to adults, like at recess. When I used to supervise recess for these children, they would often have a conflict and they would come to an adult and they would say, so-and-so did such and such. And instead of like rushing over and solving their problem, if, what I tried to cultivate in myself and what I saw in really, really great teachers was asking the children questions, saying, oh, well, tell me, did you think tell me how that made you feel, or tell me why you think that was wrong, or whatever. They're looking to adults for confirmation of their moral judgments, right? They're trying to essentially triangulate what is appropriate and what's not. They feel something very powerful. They have emotions, but they also know maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'm just really upset, because they've had that experience. And so guiding those children morally is very important. And you do that in those years. But what I've noticed is that that's also a question as they reach the phase where I get them now, this sort of early adulthood, right? After the tumultuous years of adolescence, entering into sort of the 18 to 24, they've spent, 6 years approximately, roughly from 12 to 18, thinking about themselves, what kind of person they are, how they want to change the world, what their adult ambitions are. And then they almost turn back to, in the sort of 17, 18, 19-year-old phase, of thinking again about moral considerations, because they've now, in a way, re-entered that adult world, right? They're no longer a teenager. A lot of them develop a sense of, I'm an adult. I mean, legally they are, but they think of themselves as like, it's for keeps now. It counts now, right? I don't get away with juvie court, as it were, in a moral sense, right? And it causes them to reflect as well about larger issues in the world. And so when I work with those students, it's interesting to me, the ones who have had a robust moral education, which some of them have, some of them have had what I consider to be a very good background. I mean, we may not always agree on moral issues, but they've been thoughtful about them, and they have given time and intellectual resources to considering them. They're in a completely different place from students who have never contemplated something like the basic questions when they read Plato in their first year in the program. What is justice? What is courage? Some of those questions are really hard. What does it look like? How does one know? Is it possible to have too much of it? When we make moral judgments about people, do we count more their intentions or the consequences of their actions? Et cetera, et cetera. These types of things, people can learn that, and they do. And college is, there's a kind of self-righteousness about college students that they get amped up about moral causes. But I think the ones who deal with this in a way that's healthier, right? Because one of the things about college campuses is that there's a kind of, lately there's not only an increase in, cause-headedness. I think everything's a cause, everything's related. If you don't have a position on this, who are you? You're some sort of outcast or devil or whatever. But there's also a blog post I just read a little while ago by a guy who goes by Gurwinder, I think is how he says it. I don't actually know. He's English. He calls it the rise of neo-toddlerism, which is like a lot of college students. I mean, it's and he's right. It's throwing fits, having high expectations, thinking that just because you make a demand, things will come true, et cetera, et cetera. And, there's a good to college students becoming morally informed in this way, but there's also a difference to me. The ones who have had this as part of their earlier education are more capable of dealing with this in a way that is, attuned to how the world actually works, than kind of staying in that college bubble. So, you're right. Gatto is right about these things. Like, there's a lot of implicit learning that goes on in the way that the system is designed. And if the implicit learning about these questions is some authority figure always just tells you what's moral, I mean, imagine what that does to somebody's soul. Their ability to make choices and judgments for themselves will always be compromised. Whether they turn to the group as the referent value of how they decide what's moral, or the singular figure, it's cutting off their autonomy. They're, literally from the Greek, autonomos, the ability to self-rule. Self-government in its truest, deepest, most meaningful sense isn't political. It's intellectual and character-based, right? That's what self-government is. Can you order your own life and affairs across time in a value-pursuing, goal-directed way or not? And all of the things that go into that are what education is about. Learning a bunch of facts is awesome too. but if learning the facts is at the expense of doing all those other things, you might as well just use AI, right? You just, we can't we can't create human computers that just know facts. It's about thinking methods and intellectual dispositions and character as well.
Yeah, the facts are easily attainable should you ever need to find them, especially in the era of computers in our pockets. But the software that you're running that allows you to do something with those facts, the thinking capacity, that's the part that is important. I say this very frequently in talking about how parents should think about what is and isn't successful in the education of their children, what is or isn't important. People, especially if they're homeschooling, are often very nervous about not transmitting all of the important facts or missing something. Right. And one of the things that I really try to present for people is the idea that if you're teaching your kids how to learn and how to think, the facts are all findable. If I need to learn a bunch of facts on a subject that I never learned about, I can go start Googling right now, and I can use my cognitive capacity to discern what is and isn't a good source of information and what doesn't feel biased or misleading. And I can start to formulate a collection of facts very quickly should I need them. But it's my ability to think and to learn that enables me to infinitely replicate this process, which is something you're not going to graduate from college knowing all the facts you will ever need for the rest of your life. It's a process that's important.
Right. No, and that's actually the most important thing. I mean, the example of what goes particularly awry in this area is students who only know a smattering of the facts because they haven't been given opportunity to even learn a lot of facts. Because after all, certain historical or whatever, they're out of fashion, or it's just memorization is now very frowned upon, et cetera. So students can get to adulthood and only have a smattering of facts and be deficient in how to think about the facts, how to judge what is misinformation versus real information, how to judge what is a biased source from an unbiased source, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of focus on that in education, right? How do we train children not to just believe everything they find on the internet? That's a valuable thing to think about, and it ultimately goes back to a very early age. It's not just like, oh, once you give them a tablet or a computer, teach them how to not just always believe what's online. You have to have as you said, the mental software to do that long before that. And that's the most crucial thing, because if you arrive at adulthood with only a smattering of facts and an inability to properly discover and find the facts that you don't know, like to do research, in other words, and to evaluate what you find, then you end up with students who I believe, it's hard to believe, but I've seen students who are gullible to a degree that astounds me about what their default, but it's on the internet. Like, what do you mean it's not true? And it's like, well, not everything on the internet is true. And it's like, but I thought I could always just Google things. And it's like, well, you can, but it's sort of like going into a library and saying, pick great literature. And well, but I just take a book off the shelf, don't I? No, of course you don't just take a book off the shelf. You have to have discernment. You have to have the thing called judgment. And that's the problem, is that I think, as you say, I saw a lot of nervousness about this as well in parents, is that, what if my child isn't in calculus by the time they graduate high school? It's like, well, will they have a foundation in how to think mathematically such that if and when they need calculus in their educational career, that they will be able to learn it? Or are you just ensuring that they're able to pass certain tests to get into certain classes, to do certain degrees, and they won't remember calculus? And maybe they won't ever need to remember it, but it also is like, what did you waste all that effort and training for if it was just a gateway, and then they never adopted or internalized the thinking skills, in this case, kind of mathematical reasoning that led them to be able to learn calculus, actually learn it. And this is true of all kinds of things. And so, yeah, if we just pump them full of facts, we'll never get enough facts. And if all we do is teach them how to find facts, they won't have the judgment and the discernment to know what's worth looking at and what's not. And so really it's about thinking methods and evaluating information, and understanding the context of information, how it fits in, that matters. And that's a thing that you need to start doing in childhood. Right?
Yes.
You can't wait on that. You can't wait to teach children that different, historical documents have different contexts, and you have to evaluate who wrote it, when, and why, in order to evaluate whether or not you should just credit it as a straight fact or as an opinion or as a mixture of both or whatever. Like, it's hard to do once they're adults, because it's like, once, it's almost like the magical thinking about it. If it's on a printed page, it must be true. It's like, well, let me show you some books. You tell me they disagree. Which one's true? And then again, it's like, do you trust the authority or do you trust the relevant reference group? Or do you have a means of being able to trust yourself and to know the limits of yourself, to know when you've maxed out and are on your boundaries, and then, more importantly, how to evaluate what experts to trust, right? The big question today in our culture: how do you know when to trust experts, or should you trust experts? Who are the experts? These are real questions. They're important questions. And part, I think, of the crisis of expertise that exists in our culture, that was exacerbated by COVID and is exacerbated by all these other world events, is partly that the critical thinking, to go back to like an education buzzword of 15, 20 years ago, is not there. And the thinking about that is really underdeveloped, right? Another of my favorites, Dan Willingham, whose work I bet has a really great series of articles about this, and about, what does it mean to teach critical thinking? Is it actually transferable from field to field? Thinking about thinking is hard, but there are people who do it really well. And I don't think that they are getting as much attention as they should.
One of the things that you said earlier that was really, I found very interesting, and that's sort of been an underlying thread of a lot of what we're talking about here. You talked about how when you have students come into your classroom as freshmen, you're not really teaching them how to think. They've already learned that. The underpinnings have been set in how to think about their thinking patterns and their methods and their habits. Like that all exists already. And I think this is something that doesn't get appreciated enough when we're talking about sort of the life cycle of an education. So much of K-12 is built around college admissions. Like that's what high school is. It's building a transcript to impress college admissions boards. But you're not just entering high school and all of a sudden thinking about college prep. You're going through K through 8, building up your academic repertoire so that you can start building that transcript in high school. Everything all the way back to kindergarten is predicated on the assumption that the measure of success is going to be how many prestigious college boards, acceptance boards are impressed by you.
Yeah.
And so much of how we think about education is built on college to begin with. But then there's also this idea that college is where you go to really become a thinker. And everything else is preparation for that. And there is an element of truth to that. As you are maturing, your ability to think independently is evolving. You're a young adult when you go into college. You're at a phase where you're ready to grapple with big ideas and build something of your own in a way that even in high school you were moving towards, but you weren't quite at the same capacity yet. There's this you're like a newly fledged adult in some capacity, and you're able to think at the same level that adults can. There's something in that is true, but I think we grossly overemphasize the importance of college in developing thinking, and we sort of have this misconception that kindergarten and elementary school are important in college preparedness on the one hand, but on the other hand, we don't think about them as their own right as being really important intellectual foundations. And there's one thing that I think Montessori does well is it puts a very heavy emphasis on the early years in developing habits of thought that will then carry through the rest of a person's lifetime, really. But I'm really curious how you think about that, because you've mentioned it a couple of times that this is a thing that is very relevant for you, and you've seen it at the different levels that you've worked at. And I'm curious what you think the right progression is, or like what the right relationship between these two phases of life are, or how a parent, I mean, really, I think the question is, how should a parent think about this when they're stewarding an education for their child? Because I don't think most people think about it in the most beneficial way for like really leveraging the developmental stages that kids are at.
Right. Yeah, I think you've really identified something here that is important, and that has, and Montessori is a great reference point because there are parallels in some of her thinking about earlier developments that I think apply here. As you were describing it, that this image of college as the time where you really develop those thinking skills, right? You become a better thinker and you develop, I believe is premised upon an older view of not only how college operated, although there are still undoubtedly many of my colleagues, not just at Clemson, but across universities in America and elsewhere, many people still approach it this way, although they probably are finding it doesn't work as well as it used to. But the premise was that when students arrived at college, that we knew that they were, as you said, kind of preformed, that they had thinking methods, that they had what Ayn Rand calls a psychoepistemology. They had a default way of approaching thinking and reasoning. And one of the challenges of college was that it was meant to expose them to different ways, to challenge the assumptions and premises of those ways that they were thinking, and to ask of them to give an account and to, level up their game, to really to make it such that they were understanding that although they had a thinking method and a set of assumptions and premises and so on, that they now needed to justify them more and develop them, or to integrate new ways and more sophisticated ways of doing that. And that's what college was about. That it both specialized in form, in the sense of taking on topics that were either too challenging or too specialized for their earlier education. And then that was going to feature the kinds of thinking that would help them develop that skill. The assumption behind that, though, which may not be as true today as it was in the past, is that in order for that to be successful, there has to be an original thinking method there. That's somewhat what is missing, because I think that too much education at the younger levels is, as you said, focused on the preparation for the next step to the next step to the next step. And if that next step is simply college admissions, and the way that college admissions has developed over the last, say, 60 years, to be very focused on, the kind of differentiation, and you got this class and that class and that class, you have this skill, and that skill, how well you do at it is measured in a certain way. It's a very one-dimensional way of measuring it. It's not a multidimensional approach to the holistic. And, they have essays and interviews and different things to try to fill that out. But we know that college admissions is pretty one-directional in that sense, one-dimensional rather. And if all the education backs into that, then we're missing the stage where we give them that method of thinking. One of the interesting things is that if the premise of college is that you take a class from a professor who thinks this way about the subject and that way about the subject, and you have a way, and now your intention is to temporarily adopt that way of thinking, feel it out, right? You're sophisticated enough by the time you get to college that that's what you ought to be doing, is being able to adopt not just a different perspective, as you might at an earlier age, where you say, I believe this, but what if I believe that? What would be the consequences of that? You're now saying, I have a default operating system of thinking that leads me to evaluate this kind of evidence, to make these kinds of arguments, and to get to these kinds of conclusions. Now, the kind of adoption that I'm making is, I'm not just transforming my position, I'm transforming my whole way of approaching this. So I'm maybe taking it from a wholly different perspective that involves considering different kinds of evidence, reasoning in a different kind of way, not like, Martian reasoning versus Earth reasoning or something, but reasoning about it with a texture that feels very different to what I'm used to. And I do that multiple times throughout my college career on these topics that I'm learning. And out of the end of that, I have a more refined, better, and perhaps more differentiated set of thinking tools. The interesting parallel to Montessori is that all of that process of what's explicit, or at least is explicitly the goal in college, needs to have the implicit preparation when a child is younger. The analogy here is something that was one of my favorite lessons to explain in the primary classroom in 3 to 6, when parents would ask, why is there a lesson for children to wash a table? Right? This is a very common parent question. Some parents could get over the idea of like children taking care of their own environment. Other parents were more resistant, like, when are they ever going to do that, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the really great things, if you ever watch a really skilled primary guide teach the lesson of washing a table, it's not only a fascinating thing to watch the child's fascination with the teacher and everything, but when you watch the child do it, and the care with which they do it, and the expectation of doing it right, et cetera, that they develop in themselves. But one of what's the implicit lesson there is that there's a motor skill that they're learning, right? When they learn how to wash a table, it's like almost like Daniel on Karate Kid. They learn how to wash in broad arm stroke circles of the table with this little sponge and this soapy water. And, every primary guide will tell you, you sometimes have to go back and re-clean the table if it's actually dirty. Like if they've spilled food, they're not necessarily great at cleaning a table. But there's preparation that's happening. And the preparation that's happening is that they're developing the motor skill that mimics and will later allow them to be fluid cursive writers, right? Because Montessori starts with cursive. And that arm motion, as opposed to the little crampy hand motion that some people make that they've learned a different way, is implicit in that. It's the same thing. There's a lesson, there's 4 wooden blocks that have cylinders in them of varying sizes, heights, and diameters. And the child learns how to take these out one at a time and then replace them and put them in order and do various sort of permutations of this. Again, it's explicit lesson is its sensory differentiation of various dimensionality of physical objects. They learn what's tall and short, taller and shorter, etc. They also learn what's bigger and smaller, and they learn, all these different dimensions of that. But it's also the little knobs on top of these. The child grasps like this, and they're taught to, they could grasp it like this. They could, do all kinds of ways,
Mhm.
but to grasp it like that also helps that fine motor skill entrainment in their brain
Mhm.
of how to hold a writing instrument. So there are these interesting ways that Montessori figured out that if you hope to get a child to this destination, where most children that I saw in these classrooms, are writing cursive before, writing, full language in cursive before the age of 6, and reading, and oh my gosh, reading both cursive and print, like it's not a problem to learn cursive first, uh, and doing this, it's because they've had that earlier preparation. And that phonics education, I just, got to get a kick in for how important it is. Little anecdote about a parent of mine who took her I think he was probably 5. He needed to go to the eye doctor, and she took him to the eye doctor, and the eye doctor said, what line can you read on the eye chart? And this little boy said, he said, b, f, k, d, and the eye doctor was like, wait, what? And then he realized he was making the sounds because, the proper way of learning phonics is not to learn the names of the letters, because the English names of the letters don't always correspond to the sounds that they make. The
Mhm.
way to learn it phonetically is to learn the sounds that they make, and then you can build the phonemes and then ultimately the words and so on and so forth. And the doctor finally got it, and he was like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." And then, he went through it. But the implicit lesson in what we have for the destination of critical thinking, independent thinking by the time they get to college, the lesson that the child needs to learn, it's not or table washing to writing. Instead, it's modeling, and then, bringing forward and making explicit an adult thinking method so that the child can uh, identify that, right? It's not telling the child, right? It's not a step of lessons. It's not, step one is identify the facts. Step two is decide which facts are most important, because that's not a lesson that let's say a 7-year-old can learn. Instead, one of the most crucial lessons to helping a child develop a thinking method is modeling a thinking method. And so one of the things that, Montessori guides do throughout the educational levels is they do what is sometimes called sportscasting or telecasting, where they narrate their own processes so that children can hear as well as observe what's going on. Now, in lessons which are based on physical movements and manipulatives, that's very easy to do because you can just describe what you're doing. In cognitive lessons, it's a little more challenging, but it's nevertheless still possible for an individual adult, as they're working with a child and walking them through, what is it that you're thinking? How are you thinking about this? And one of the things that I did, even in adolescent ages, with students in my science classes, anytime that they would ask me a question, not anytime, a lot of times when they would ask me a question, I could easily, readily answer what their question was. I could just say, blank. But I knew that that wasn't going to be helpful to them. What was going to be helpful was, who? That's a really interesting question. How do you think we can find out? Right. And so I went on many, many journeys of discussing with a child, or an adolescent in that case, what is the process by which we go about finding this out? Sometimes they were stumped and I had to prime the pump a little bit. And sometimes they would say, well, I think it would be this. And I would say, oh, well, where did that get you? And it's a lot of that relationship building in a cognitive way with a child, where I would do days in class where we would have question days where the students, even I taught history as well because it was my specialty. So I taught 6th grade history for a while, but we would have days where I would run it as like kind of an open curiosity day. There was a cork board in the classroom where they could post questions that we would chase down, like really, really sometimes in the science classes, really crazy questions. Um, but it was all about knowing that modeling thinking and narrating some of that was what allowed the students to observe it, because otherwise and I saw this sometimes, and I see this certainly in college students. Sometimes you get students who have the mirage of thinking, right? They are, and this is like, I think this happens a lot with the reading instruction as well. I mean, I know from having, read a lot about this and seen this, students who don't learn phonics often are great memorizers, right? People who learn whole language methods, parents will describe that they have a favorite book and they can read it. And then you give them a different book and they have no idea. And then you take the book that they know and you say, what's in the book? And they can recite it because they've memorized hearing their parents say it. That can happen with thinking as well, right? Students can, in effect, memorize certain patterns of putting information together, whether that's inductive fallacies or formal, logical fallacies or whatever, and apply it in the wrong ways. And it looks a lot like thinking. And sometimes it's even successful. In the same way that students sometimes over-focus on memorizing algorithms and mathematical processes without understanding the underlying mathematics, and then they just apply it to every formula, and then suddenly that doesn't always apply. That can happen with thinking too. And I think the cause of that is not enough explicitness about the thinking. So in my science classes, another way of thinking about this, another way that I approached this was I always started students with materials and with the process of working themselves through how certain principles of, in the case, say, like electromagnetism, how they were discovered, right? And the purpose of this was to ensure that they failed, right? And I once gave a lecture on the power of failure in childhood education. There's an enormous power of error and failure, right? What's productive of learning is not always succeeding. If you succeed, I mean, Edison had a great story about this when he invented the phonograph, like the little wax cylinder that he recorded something on, and it worked the first time. He said he was never more afraid in his life because nothing ever worked the first time. And this was like, wait a minute, something's wrong. But there's an enormous educational value to not getting it right every time, to seeing the ways that things go wrong. And I think that education has lost the value of that, right? That there's a punishment for failure. There's not a productive, like, hey, let's figure out why you failed, or let's figure out why something went wrong. Let's figure out what the error is. At the earliest stages in Montessori education, what she calls the control of error is reality, right? These materials are designed in such a way that the child doesn't need an adult to tell them that they've done it wrong. Literally, the materials themselves will tell them. Like it's built into the way the materials work. Like they won't go together except the right way. They will fall down if you build them wrong, or they won't all fit in. There'll be leftover materials, and you know that they all have to fit in, or whatever it is. The same thing can hold true of cognitive learning. You can scaffold ways for students to confront questions and talk to them about those questions that give them the opportunity of seeing something not working on their own without the adult, the authority coming in and saying that's wrong. I had students in a history class say, like they would come across something where they were like, I'm trying to think of an example. I think it was sometime in the Middle Ages, and they were comparing different things, and they said, how would it be possible for this to be the same as this if they were separated by 300 years? And like they figured it out on their own, but it took them going out and kind of confronting, lining these things up for that to happen, rather than me just saying, this happened then and this happened then, and you just have to remember the order. That sets up that skill later in early adulthood of students taking on different ways of thinking, refining their ways of thinking, because they're not afraid of making mistakes. They know that errors can be instructive. Sometimes just mildly, but sometimes very profoundly instructive. Mm-hmm. And they know that it's a journey in a way, that the thinking process, that there are multiple steps. It's not just an either or, an if then, like do the test, get the score, etc. They know that it's like iterative and cyclical in that process, or spiral, I suppose. And so, yeah, for parents, for people who are listening that are concerned about making sure that their children are developing these types of ways of thinking, the best piece of guidance I can give is when they ask you questions, don't always give them the answer. Don't be stingy and say, oh, I won't answer your question, but start to model curiosity for them, and then start to model for them the process of thinking through the question and thinking about how to answer the question. Because every good question can be Googled. Maybe you don't get the answer through Google, but every good question can be looked up. I mean, unless it's an unanswered question. But every child could use someone saying, what would we need to know in order to know that? Which, what gets them back a step, which is part of the thinking process. What are the contextual things that condition our knowledge of this thing? If we don't know A, B, and C, how is it that we know, Z? Well, because Z, you have to know A, B, and C in order to really know Z. Let's go back and talk about A, B, and C. And modeling that for your children and being willing, it's, raising children and teaching children is a patience game. But man, is it fascinating, because if you give them the time, the kinds of insights and things, it's like the things kids say, and the beauty of the way that you watch them figure things out, and the moment of realization. I mean, if you could bottle that, man, bottle the look on a student's face when they figure out how to think for themselves about a problem. But if you don't provide that for them so that they can see it, because otherwise, asking questions, giving answers, lecturing. It's like the old thing about, I walked into a physics class and they just started writing Newton's laws. What do you learn from that, right? If you learn about what the questions were and what the problems were that led to someone trying to formulate answers that ultimately led to these things, right? Teaching science historically, that's incredibly valuable, right? Same thing with history. You don't just start in and say, on this date, such and such happened. You have to set up the whole context. It's a story. That allows them to see the development and allows them to model how it happens. And then you have to, as a teacher or as a parent, you have to be very explicit about that and lead them step by step. And then, be willing to tolerate a lot of error, but it's explore it. Those errors are fun, right? I mean, for me, that's, I'm endlessly fascinated by this. Now it's more about interpreting, complex philosophic texts and why do you think that? Do you think that this person's really saying that, et cetera? But it's also about, I don't just come in and say, here's what Adam Smith said. You did the reading. Here's Adam Smith from A to Z. It's, let's read a passage together and let's contemplate, how do you take that? What do you take that to mean? How does that integrate with your other knowledge about what Adam Smith is trying to say? Is there anything in your life that relates to this, right? It's all a process of, and then sometimes, in my classes, sometimes it's about, I put on the perspective, like I take on, not multiple personas, it sounds a little psychotic, but I take on different guises, so to speak. And the students know, right? I mean, when we're reading Karl Marx, and I take on his perspective when they have questions and I answer back as though I'm making the best case for him and then explaining that best case in his own terms, they learn Marx a lot better. I mean, Marx is notoriously hard, but that helps them. And then I can shift out of that and say, oh, well, what would, Smith say about that? Or what would we say about that today? Or what would someone in his own day say about that? And that kind of moving around the topics, if they have that basis as a child of being explicit and then reintegrating thinking methods, they're going to be able to, just soar right through that. And I see some students do. I mean, it's amazing to see the ones who have that preparation, because when you give them the tools at this age, they just run with it. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. It makes teaching so much easier in a way. You still have to grade and stuff like that. But
there's still some work involved.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's a kind of, I think done well and done with students who have the kinds of preparation that make them, good at learning. It makes it makes it the kind of thing where it's like, I can't believe they paid me to do this. It's that kind of work. It's the work that energizes as much as it is, enervating. So.
This has been so fascinating. We could very easily keep going for 2 more hours.
Sure
I have so many more questions I want to ask you,
yeah.
But I also want to be respectful of your time, because I know that you have classes starting in not very many days and you're in start of school week. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. If people want to know more about you, if they want to read more of your work, they want to know more about the programs that you're running, where would you send them next?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, it's easy to find, although I should probably spell Clemson, not everybody knows, CLEMSON .edu/capitalism. That's our main homepage. From there, they can find out more about the Lyceum program. And from there, they can find out more about our public programs. They can watch some of the public lectures that we've hosted, read more about the curriculum, what we've done in the past, what we're doing in the future. About me, I did once start a personal website. I have almost nothing on it. I had a friend build it for me, and I have been entirely deficient in updating it. And I had a Substack that was running for a little while that I have, for other obligation reasons, not kept up with. So I'm a little bit, I suppose, a bit under the radar. But I mean, if people are interested, I'm always willing to correspond with people and whatnot. Or as often happens, somebody might bump into me at a conference and say, "Oh, I heard you on Hannah's podcast." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, great. Let's talk." So, but yeah, I mean, if people, my academic work has been about American legal history, about monopolies, and I've written about the history of individualism. But most of what I do is in the classroom. It's really my passion, my focus. And going to the Clemson Institute's website is a great way to find out more about that. And I will make this sort of tease because it's not yet public, but it will be soon. We will be sometime this fall launching a new project that I'll be just one person among many that's involved in it, but that you'll be able to find through the Clemson Institute's website. That will be the tease would be thoughts and insights about great books from people who work with them all the time. So coming soon, I guess, so to speak, and undoubtedly will be announced. We have an Instagram that one of my program coordinators keeps up. I don't actually know the handle. I think it's just Clemson Capitalism. But you can find all of that from our webpage. And find out more about what we do, and on the Instagram, find that we do a little scholar spotlight, so you can hear from some of our scholars speaking about their experience. Yeah,
amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This was such a delight.
Absolutely, it was a great pleasure. Like you said, I wish we had 6 more hours, but we're not Joe Rogan.
We may have to do this again.
Hey, yeah, why not?
Perhaps the consolation prize.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much for this. Good luck with the start of class this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Been a pleasure.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.